BYU quarterback Jake Retzlaff has formally broken his silence via his legal team in a response filed against the lawsuit against him alleging sexual assault, and we now have his side of the story.
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? Welcome into Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast focused on the BYU Cougars. I'm Jake Hatch, executive producer at the KSL Sports Zone in Salt Lake City, Utah, and a 13-year credentialed media member at BYU. I am your resident expert and insider as your host here on this podcast. And as always, thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. All right. If you did not see this, Friday evening, I'm recording this late Friday night, in the interest of full disclosure, but earlier on Friday evening, a formal response to the civil lawsuit filed against BYU quarterback Jake Retzlaff was filed by his legal team. Now, in this response, Retzlaff, through his attorneys, requested the quote, the complaint be dismissed that plaintiff AG, which is the woman who accused him, has been identified as only AG in any of the filings, take nothing, and that Mr. Retzlaff is fully reimbursed for his fees and costs incurred to defend against this meritless case, unquote. It came in a 14-page filing. I've had a chance to review it myself, and I will be very blunt. Many of you know this. I'm not a legal expert. I will endeavor over this coming weekend to make sure that I get more clarification on this, but I'm going to go straight down the middle, explain exactly what the response is and what it potentially could mean for Jake Retzlaff. Now, in the response, Retzlaff also, quote, denies each and every allegation contained, unquote, in the original complaint, including that he, quote, bit, raped, or strangled the accuser after she drove from a residence near the University of Utah campus in Salt Lake City to his apartment in Provo. Now, in this, Mr. Retzlaff, speaking of Jake, and the accuser had a pleasant and entirely consensual evening together. In other words, he admits to having consensual sex with this woman. That is one thing to take away from this, that Jake Retzlaff does admit on the record to having a consensual sexual relationship with this woman. But as he mentions here, quote, they had a pleasant and entirely consensual evening together, playing video games and a normal evening of consensual sexual interaction that was uneventful but pleasant, with the plaintiff sleeping over and leaving the next morning to return to Salt Lake City. Now, I, along with many others, reached out to BYU to see if they had a formal response or they would be issuing a formal statement on the matter. I was told by BYU's PR team they were referring all questions back to the university's initial statement at the time of the lawsuit. So that is where things stand with regards to talking to the university. And they said this, speaking of the situation, that BYU on that Wednesday afternoon said, quote, BYU became aware that a civil lawsuit involving Jake Retzlaff has been filed this morning. The university takes any allegations seriously, following all processes and guidelines mandated by Title IX. Due to federal and university privacy laws and practices for students, the university will not be able to provide additional comment, unquote. They referred us back to that statement. That's where things stand with regards to BYU on this. Now, continuing on in this response by Jake Retzlaff's legal team is that they do allege, after the alleged incident, which was the interaction between this AG and Jake Retzlaff, the alleged assault was accused to have taken place on or about November 23rd, 2023. They say this. The response noted that when the encounter occurred, the Retzlaff was, quote, not publicly identified as an NFL draft prospect following BYU's 5-7 campaign in 2023. But then this was filed in May when, quote, the plaintiff AG hired a Salt Lake City lawyer and made her first ever claim of rape linked to a large monetary demand from Mr. Retzlaff following BYU's 11-2 campaign in 2024. Retzlaff in the complaint also alleged that he and this woman, AG, had no contact, text, in person, phone calls, etc., during the entirety of last season in 2024. And that they also mentioned that the woman and him, in fact, shared what they called flirty and fun text messages. That's the quote, flirty and fun text messages for multiple weeks after this alleged assault was to have taken place, including banter back and forth about the BYU and Utah rivalry. Now, also as they continue, there was another note in the response that Retzlaff allegedly accused her, quote, had sex with one or more Utah football players and then reported to Provo police 4 or 5 days later that she was assaulted by a, quote, childhood friend from Salt Lake City. The response in there says that the lawsuit filed against Retzlaff was an attempt to, quote, extort money from him, and that whichever Utah football player was a childhood friend of hers who she did identify to the police as her assailant, that's very important here, must be a bench warmer or even a starter for Utah, is not a viable target for payment, and is not an NFL draft prospect, unquote. In other words, they say that Jake Retzlaff and this woman had consensual sex. That is one thing that Jake Retzlaff admits in this statement, but it says that her assailant, speaking of any alleged assault, was, in fact, a Utah football player who is or was a childhood friend of the alleged victim here. So, where do things stand with regards to BYU and Jake Retzlaff? That is a great question that I don't have a good answer on this. Speaking from my personal standing on this matter is that it's going to take some time for this to continue to shake out. But the fact that we now have Jake Retzlaff's response, and by the way, I'm barely scratching the surface. It feels like I was just pulling quotes that I thought were most pertinent to this situation for this special edition of the podcast. But it is going to take some time for BYU to obviously respond to this and to adjudicate whatever is going to happen. My personal opinion on this matter is that this response essentially tells the court, it was filed in 3rd District Court in the state of Utah. And also, I should also add that it alleges that filing this in Salt Lake City or Salt Lake County is the wrong place to file it because the alleged assault was to have taken place in Provo, Utah. So therefore, it needs to be redistricted if it is going to be litigated. That's one thing it also asks for in this response. But it also, I think, in my opinion, I'm, like I said, not a legal expert, but looking at this from my vantage point, is that this is asking for this whole lawsuit to be tossed out. It is saying it's meritless. That's the quote, it's meritless, and that Jake Retzlaff should be exonerated and allowed, at least from his legal team side of things, to continue his playing career at BYU. What I think this says is that Jake Retzlaff, considering that getting all over the place, but the fact that he admits to having a consensual sexual encounter with this woman, that pushes this to where the honor code now will, I think, have the say on whatever the playing status is of Jake Retzlaff. Now, that'll obviously go through university leadership, potentially the board of trustees with regards to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who runs Brigham Young University. And obviously, there will be some sort of response, I'm sure, from BYU on this front. What it will be, TBD, because we're in a new era of college sports. I know many people are pointing back to the Brandon Davies situation when he was suspended, but then ultimately withdrew from school for a semester after he admitted to have impregnated a woman during 2011, during the height of the Jimmer Fredette run there, if you recall that incident back in 2011, which made national news. That obviously sidelined and curbed a team that many thought had a chance to go to the Final Four that season. But as it came out that Brandon Davies sat out the rest of that season and then ultimately withdrew from school for a semester before re-enrolling at BYU. What does that mean for Jake Retzlaff? I have no idea, because we're now a full 14 years on from that incident with Brandon Davies, and we're in a new era of college sports. We're in a new era of how BYU handles their honor code issues. They very much, as I mentioned in the statement from BYU, handle things in-house in a very private manner. That changes, I think, the whole dynamic here, not to mention that we are now going into an era where there is revenue sharing coming into effect, and there is millions potentially on the line with regards to Jake Retzlaff and playing out his playing career at BYU. I don't know how BYU is going to respond. I'll be very blunt about that. And I would imagine that it may take some time for them ultimately to make the decision on this. What we do know now is now we have both sides of the story. We have the lawsuit from AG, the woman who accused Jake Retzlaff of sexual assault. Now we have Jake Retzlaff responding in kind, as was expected, a formal response where he categorically, as I said, denies any and all allegations of sexual assault, but admits to consensual sex with this woman. That's where things stand. What happens next, where it turns, whatever is going to happen, we'll continue to break it down. But it is another part of this entire saga. And I think the next one, I would hope, comes in the relatively near future. but it remains up to BYU. It feels like at this point they have, I think, probably the next say on anything with regards to Jake Retzlaff. Will there be something in place by the time we get to Big 12 Media Days in just over, it feels like a week's time from now, or about 10-ish days out or so? TBD. But that feels like kind of the next big, I guess, timeline for tracking this along the way. When Kalani Sitake and players will be asked about it, yeah, they're going to be put on the point down there at Big 12 Media Days. And I would imagine that BYU, I would hope, would have more clarification on this, or they could continue with the current circumstance of referring back to the initial statement and saying, hey, we have no further word on this at this time. All right, that is going to do it for this special edition of the podcast. I wanted to get it out there, give you guys kind of the straightforward, this is what Jake Retzlaff alleges from his side via his legal team of what happened during this encounter. And suffice it to say that okay, let's break this down real quick. Number one, he admits to having consensual sex with this woman. Number two, that they cut off communication, had no communications at all, and until after last year's bowl game in 2024 was the first time this woman reached out to him, as they said, quote, tried to extort him for money after he had been projected potentially as an NFL player. And as I mentioned, I think the next step, in my opinion, goes with BYU when it comes to the honor code and what they will what they will put down in terms of potential punishment for Jake Retzlaff with regards to the honor code. That's where things stand. So as always, thank you for being with us here on Locked On Cougars. Thank you for making this podcast your first listen every day. And as always, thank you for being an everydayer right here on the Locked On Cougars podcast.